So this would be your first class of the day. This is the basic schedule. So 0, 1, 2, Wednesday. 1, 2, 3 on Thursday. I'm sorry. 3, 4, 5, and then 6, 7 on Friday. And you'll notice the afternoon class begins at 11:50. That means lunch ends before that. That means you got to be in there ready to go. That doesn't really affect us any in this period. Like I said, it affects my second and fifth. And so, does anyone have all 3 tests on Thursday? A few? Any of them going to be, okay, mine will be all writing. Will the other classes be writing? So your hands will be like, what? You get into a flow, a rhythm. See, I'm here to help. And that's life. And make sure you bring paper. Oh, I'll tell you one thing really quick. You got all writing. Pencil, of course, you can erase mistakes. I get a pen is for you to write with because you want to practice. Pencil is fine. But then again, if you're worried about mistakes, pencils are easier. Mechanical pencils work a little bit better than sharpened pencils, but there's other issues with that. And so I decided on 18 for that. So you have to do 2 and then 16 others. And basically what I want to have is a couple columns of those ones that are not rolled. And you have to do like 5 total from that. And like 11 of the others. That's my list. I'll just put it on the list. Maybe if you look at the list, I didn't know where I would finish, but I didn't quite get to business cycle on it. I didn't quite get to, I was hoping to get to the panic. I'm not going to get there. So everything from business cycle down will not be on there. So I will kind of, be more choices on the other ones. And for some reason, I didn't even realize I did this. I put campaign of 1864 and the election of 1864. I don't know if you noticed that. It's the same thing. I didn't realize I did that. And so, no, you don't. They're not different. I just didn't even realize I did that. Yes. Yeah, the Bacon's Rebellion. So I want you to know, you have to know some idea of the time for each one. The decade's better, but at least, some time period. But for those 2, you have to know the exact date. Bacon's Rebellion is 1676. Gettysburg Address is 1863. 1863 is important for the election of 64, and it's coming up to the climactic year of the Civil War, and therefore the United States. Yeah. Okay, remember short ID formats. One good sentence summary, one good sentence of an example of it, and then an analysis. Why it's important, what it affects. What's that? Most of the time now. Most of the time, what came out. So the big thing was, like Texas and the Mexican-American War. That led to the issue of slavery in the territories, which would be the main cause of the Civil War, seen like the with compromise measures that failed, compromise measures failed in law. Any questions? I'll go over anyone. Yes. Shades Rebellion, I guarantee that will be one of your choices. And Shades Rebellion, the big thing about that one is that it showed all the weaknesses of the financial system of the Articles of Confederation. That farmers were being hammered by deflation and low prices and no political representation. The reason there was deflation was these are laws. And so they revolted. And the big thing about it is that the revolt was put down, but it showed how weak the Articles of Confederation were. The federal government could not use power to put down a rebellion within its borders. No power at all, no army. And it showed the weakness of the financial system. And the outcome, the effect of this, it would convince it was the wealthy elite that we had to have strong central government. And regular people think they have too much power, aka too much democracy. So we need a strong central government, therefore an anti-democratic. That's why Jackson on democracy. Because we haven't said, no, we're going to make it democratic, even though the document itself is. Any other questions? Jen? Say the first part again. Yeah, we're really scared that all the lower class would rebel. And so they decide to differentiate between people who were slaves and people who had contracts like indentured servants. And say that those who came from indentured servants, someday they will have more rights. Where those who are slaves, there'll be slave codes, and the most important of the slave codes that came out of the rebellion would be the publication laws, making slavery permanent, hereditary, and more by color and skin. So the big thing about Bacon rebellion is those slave codes would lead directly to what we call racism today. But all of them, the term wasn't around. Another one. Yeah, so I'm gonna be 5 or 6. So I'll narrow it down. I'll give you an example, like what I'm going to do. See Texas and the Mexican War and slavery in the territories. I looked at that, they're very close. So I'll probably only choose one. That's just an example of what I'll probably end up doing. So I'll give you some terms, and I'm going to choose. But you can guarantee Shades of Rebellion will be on. Declaration of Independence is going to be on. Mercantilism is going to be. Any others? Any others? Yes. Lost Cause, and I would bet that's going to be on there. No, I have not officially made it. Well, they're making a test like that. It's relatively easy. The hard part is just kind of figure out what terms. Okay. Then I punish myself by having a lot of ethics are great. But that gives you an opportunity to write what you know, and it's worth it. It is worth it. I remind myself of that. It's worth it to know. You know. Back to Lost Cause. This would be an idea that came about after Reconstruction ended, that the Civil War was actually a noble fight for states' rights and not about slavery. The fight was never about slavery, thus implying a northern invasion. A northern invasion. And so an example of this would be, is that calling it the war between the states, the Civil War, and not the Civil War, what everyone called it. Or that saying that Reconstruction was actually the Northern goal because they hated the South so much. They implied Reconstruction. And the big result about this is that the Lost Cause then would be used as an excuse, the Lost Cause, for the Redeemer governments to take away rights of freedmen. And the big thing is, for the Redeemer governments to have Jim Crow laws. Because the war was never about slavery, and therefore the whole 14th and 15th Amendment should never have happened. This would be kind of the idea of the Democratic Party. Southern Democrats. Remember the Democrats are different from the Democrats. Turn up. Yes. John Brown, that's another one. I'm pretty sure that will be on there. John Brown, who got famous in Leading Kansas, abolitionist. His idea was to capture the arsenal of Harper's Ferry and arm slaves off the slave rebellion. He was tired of Southern bullying, and somebody had to act. It's fine. But the big example of what happened is he did not leave Harper's Ferry. He allowed himself to get bottled in. He did not start a slave rebellion. Maybe he wanted to be a martyr. We're not 100% sure, but he would be captured. But why is it so important? John Brown would, without a civil war, this freaked the South. And Southern politicians became terrified that Northerners were going to trigger more slave rebellions with greatest fear. And that meant that every Northern politician, let me phrase that, every Republican was a John Brown in surprise. It's John Brown in disguise, ready to cut their throats. That's why it's so important. The thing about it, Abraham Lincoln's elected, He's not this migrant free soiler. He's John Brown. That's why it's so such a polarizing thing. Yes. So railroad in the Buffalo, the whole thing about that is the Transcontinental Railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad Act. The Transcontinental Railroad will be finished in 1869 with the help of the U.S. government. Central Pacific and Union Pacific. The Central Pacific, Union Pacific, so Transcontinental Railroad. And once that happened, that would split the Buffalo. And that would rapidly accelerate the U.S. policy of total, the destruction of the West. What will the outcome of that be? The absolute destruction of the various tribes, mostly the common reservations, culminating with things like you go all the way to Wounded Knees. Once you built the railroads, I see. Or just reading. So give me two factors. Yeah, so factors could be, we went through a bunch of factors. I went through like, yeah, there's so many of them. So like government support, or, you know, we just had right here about corporations. We're soon going to have other policies. Innovation is another big one. Railroads, just railroads is a big innovation. Give me two, then the opposite. The others. The two you have to know, and then I just pick. So, like total war attrition in the 1864 campaigns are very, they're very. So I might just pick total war and attrition and expect you to use an example of something from 1860, like the March to the Sea. Does that make sense for everybody? Yeah, I think they're all good points, and you know, if we were doing, since I have to limit it down to 18, I want to make sure that it's broad enough where you can use them as examples. Just give you an example. And so there's either going to be 10 or 11 from the whole, and 5 or 6 additional ones from them. So, for example, if I have the Declaration of Independence, I think you have to know kind of the approximate date. You better know the date of the Declaration. That's July 4th, 1776. You damn well better. But if you use the Declaration of Independence, you have to get that idea of equality, unalienable rights, and social contract. Remember, that's what governments are created to protect rights. When they don't, they can be changed. And why is that important? That would be used as justification that the British were depriving the colonies of their rights with laws like the Tea Act, etc., depriving them of their rights that would lead directly to the Declaration or directly to the War for Independence. That's why it's so important. The Declaration of Independence. And then you could say, but that would set the stage for Abraham Lincoln using it in the Gettysburg Address. Say this is the kind of country to be based upon equality. This Declaration of Independence is not law. But you really see it become the philosophical background of the country. See Lincoln saying, "No, this is what we're going to be." Do we always achieve that? No. All the instruction. Any other questions? I'll be glad to answer it. Yes. Dawes Act, guaranteed Dawes Act will be on there. And that's the culmination of the Indian Wars, where the idea was is to turn reservation tribes on the reservation, the members, tribal members, into, and they literally said, white farmers by giving them a homestead. But it was an absolute unmitigated disaster. Those who did start a homestead almost all lost their farms, and they divvied up the reservation land and gave it to non-tribal members. What's the result of this? Over half of the land on reservations today, sometimes even more, are owned by non-tribal members, leading to absolute poverty and hopelessness on the reservations. There's reason why there's such a there could be a difficult life on reservation. It was wrong. laws. Yes. Oh, yeah, and the Burke Act, another way to look at it is, yeah, you can have the Burke Act and talked about, literally ripping children away from their families so they can be taught to not be tribal members, which of course dismally background. Good example, really good one. Yeah, the Dawes Act and the Burke Act kind of go hand in hand with the Dawes Act. It's quite a lot. No, they did not. That was not the plan, but it did mean if you have a poorly crafted law, it won't be. And then, yeah. Which one? So Jim Crow laws and voting go together, but the big thing were those are done by the Redeemer governments after Reconstruction. And these are the laws basically to get rid of all the rights that came with Reconstruction and the 14th Amendment. And so Jim Crow laws were the legal segregation of the South by race. Which created an economic underclass because they could not participate in the economy. That's a big thing. It wasn't just segregation. It's the creating of an economic underclass they can't get on. And the 50th Amendment was supposed to give the right to vote. But since it was so poorly written, it would allow for things like the grandfather's clause that would deprive freedmen of the right to vote, and therefore they could not change to. So what do we have in economics? There's another one. Any other one? Yes. Say it again. Which rebellion? Oh, it's on the list? Oh, someone's rebellion. It won't be on the test. But that rebellion was in South Carolina. And that was a small, it was another slave rebellion that was. And, but it will not be on the test. But it is an example of the fear of a slave rebellion. And so it would be triggered by 1720. And the rebellion was a failed slave rebellion, which is Freetown, South Carolina. And the big thing about South Carolina was there were very few people of European descent there because of the threat of malaria. And so it really led to them being outnumbered. So Stone led them to be outnumbered in fear of rebellion, and that would lead to their fear of things like we have other ones like Gabriel Presser and then the top of my is South Carolina fear. Is there another? Yes. Mention what? No, you just mention gold, you're fine. But you have to mention at least gold. If you mention specie, that's the same thing, that's just gold coins, either one works. But they said you generically want to accumulate as much gold as possible. What's the best way? Maximize exports and get colonies to provide raw materials. Yes. So Texas and the Mexican War, we have to go into every detail about this, but the big thing about Texas and the Mexican War was that Texas wanted to come in as a slave state, and Texas would win their independence when Mexico tried to ban slavery. And that would trigger the whole fight about slavery in the territories. And that would lead directly to the United States wanting to purchase California, which would lead to the Mexican-American War, which the US would win. So we're not going to go into great detail about that. It was close, but the US would win. And the big thing about both of them was it would trigger the argument about slavery in the territories. Slavery in the territories. Denmark Vesey. That's what I knew it would pop into my head. In 1820, the threat of slavery rebellion in South Carolina. But the issue of slavery in the territories. So the Mexican-American War in Texas would directly lead to the compromise slave trade. An attempt to try to push back as it would turn out. So any others? Yeah. So French and Indian War, the big thing was this is one of the wars of empire between Britain and France. Britain and France with the colonies and the various tribes in the middle. And it would all start by George Washington trying to get land in the Ohio River Valley. George Washington, important necessity. And would turn into a worldwide war for empire. The British, the example of what would happen, the British would win in the Americas by taking Quebec. Thus lead to a British victory. To a clear British victory in Treaty of Paris, 1763. But why is the French and Indian War so important? Britain went into debt fighting all these wars for empire. And with the French threat gone, they decided to start enforcing mercantilism, ending salutary neglect with laws like the Stamp Act to make the colonies help pay for their debt, which would lead to the series of steps that led to the American Revolution. Hey, what is it called? The people who own the corporation. People who own the corporation are only, even if the corporation goes under, they're only out with the invested in the corporation. What is that called? Limited liability is right there on the board. Limited liability. So corporations, let's get to them. Are there any more questions? Let's go. Last couple things then. And yes, these will be on the test. Corporation. We had corporation. Remember the whole thing about limiting risk? And they want to do whatever it takes to try to limit risk. Limit risk. The bigger they get, what is it called? The bigger you get, you have a competitive advantage. Economies of scale. And get bigger. The problem is it's risk. So did we get to limited liability? We got to this, right? Did we get to this? Other people's money? And encourage. So corporations will encourage vast amounts of innovation that would never happen. And it'll also encourage a lot more debt. There's going to be a lot more, it's called leveraging, using your corporation as collateral and then borrowing more money. Every corporation has so much debt, it's kind of shocking how much debt. Everybody's in debt. Debt, debt, debt. Well, it also encourages profit taking. Pay yourself more. Or even take money from your corporation to buy your own stock, increasing the value of the stock and getting more money. That's what corporations do now. Boeing just did like $100 billion of stock buybacks last year. Why? Get more money for themselves. Yeah, the thing about corporations we have to understand. Their number one goal is to make money for their investors. It's not to produce products. It's not to create jobs. It's to produce money for their investors. We just have to understand that. That's what they want to do. You can say that's a good thing or bad thing. You can say that's good for the country or bad for the country. You have these corporations that only want to make money. But we got to know that's what they want to do. So a whole new financial system will have to be developed. New banks called investment banks are going to be created. And they're banks that loan money to corporations, corporations. If I put C-O-R-P-S, that's core. That's a French word for usually a military organization. That's why I've put the period in there. You know, sometimes I forget. And Marine Corps, it's corps, it's core, it's French. But they make loans, or they're investors in corporations. They buy, they help them set up the corporations, investment banks. So the most famous would be like Goldman Sachs or JP Morgan. The banks you might think about, that you go have a savings account, get a car loan, those are called commercial banks. And they make small business loans to private companies. Investment banks are an entirely different form of investment. So they invest money in corporations. And don't forget, if a corporation goes default, can't pay back its debt, who's liable for their debts? Yeah, the entity called the corporation, aka the beast. So these banks have a vested interest for these corporations to make money. Because if they don't make money, they don't get their money back. So it also can consolidate. Corporations allow you to get bigger, and that's the big advantage. There's other tax laws and all kinds of things, but corporations allow for bigger companies, which give you a competitive advantage. Now, not every company is good for a corporation. Their advantage to be privately owned or a partnership. For example, if you're going to start a little company where you have a lawnmower, you want to go mow lawns, probably not a good idea to spend the money to start a corporation. You're really not going to make much. But for some businesses, it does work. But it's just all legal. And that is going to be up in the air for much of this century. Part of Jacksonian democracy was anti-corporation, aka the Bank of the US. Is this all legal? And these are corporate owners scooping up parts of the market and basically scooping up part of the country. So here's the deal. Okay, democracies by definition, a democratic government, meaning where the people have some sovereignty, not a pure democracy, but where the people, for example, vote for their leaders. They fear concentrated wealth. That was the whole element of Jacksonian democracy. Concentrated wealth was controlling politics, but it's also the basis of the United States. The Tea Act would be the Tea Act would lead to the Tea Party, which would there's revolution after the Tea Party. And the whole Tea Act, no anger over the Tea Act was the monopoly given to the East India Company. It was not the tax. They didn't like the tax, but it was a monopoly. So they fear monopolies. There's a lot of cartoons at this time showing businesses as just money bags. Just money bags. So every company will try to limit the size. But I should add one thing. Every company wants to operate like a monopoly. So governments fear monopolies, but every company wants a monopoly or operate like it. Does that make sense? We've already mentioned this yesterday. Monopolies, money without risk. This is basically what it is. I'm just naming games. By the way, have you noticed that monopoly is a monopoly? Does anyone like Monopoly? Seems like every game of Monopoly I played, I played it in college, ended with Fist. And so, don't get me wrong, they can be fun. No, they're not. Yeah, I'm not kidding about that. And the actual game of Monopoly was originally going to be an anti-monopoly game called Avalon, and it turned into this cutthroat, mean, nasty game of Monopoly, right? So back to this. So you have fear monopoly, want to operate like a monopoly. So every state limited the size. How did they do it? By corporations not owning other corporations. This is all politics. So you have business leaders who want things to operate like monopolies, and democracies who are saying, no, we don't want this. We're scared. We have to limit the size because economic power equals directly to political power. So it's all politics. So here's where we get to the thing. We know that companies, everybody who operates a business wants to have something like monopoly. So there's that push-pull. But for democracies, they fear it because it's bad for democracy. So those with wealth, we start seeing the 1880s, especially 1870s too. They begin to do everything they can to control politics. Everything they can. Because they want to change these laws. What do we call a country that's controlled by a few? That's an oligarchy. So that's a term you have to know. My expectation is if I say the word oligarchy, you'll know what it means. Ruled by a few. It comes from ancient Greece. And basically it's a few powerful people. So it could be anything. It could be business leaders. It could also be military leaders. It could be kind of an intellectual oligarchy. It could be a hereditary oligarchy, but ruled by a few. Now, there is a term by ruled by the wealthy. An oligarchy of the wealthy is called a plutocracy. That's a plutocracy. So a plutocrat is somebody who's exceedingly wealthy. Unfortunately, that word is not used much anymore. I always think that's a very good term for it. Oligarchy. They want to control. We know they want to control it because they want to change the rules. So we have this continuous push-pull. So, I want to operate like a monopoly. They want to change the laws. Well, the first thing they did is, what if we just find loopholes? Find loopholes. So the first thing they did to try to operate like a monopoly was a pool. They want to operate like a monopoly. A pool is a cartel. Another term for it is a cartel. And it's a group of companies a group of companies a group of competitors. And what they do is they set a price floor. This one's stuff. You need to start over. Okay, I did. I just had to see something. They set a price floor. And what they say is every competitor agrees to not undercut each other. If every competitor agrees not to undercut each other, that means guaranteed profits. Guaranteed profits, at least for some. Now, let me ask you something. Does a pool help a big company more or a small company more? It depends. If you set the price floor fairly high, it'll help small. Because remember, big companies have the advantage because of economies of scale. So do you see why they're weak? By definition, a pool is fraud. You're defrauding the customer. The customer can sue, and this is a criminal act of defraud. This is fraud. If you set prices, it's fraud. So we got that, it's fraud. So, will pools last? All it takes is one person to say, I'm gonna undercut you. But I'm gonna take it. What do you complain? How do you complain if somebody undermines your legal organization? How dare you? You violated our illegal pacts. You set prices by following the law. So they always fit. A good example of this were the first subways built in the United States were in New York City, and they tried to make pools to set the prices on these early subways, and it failed miserably. Just miserably. Also led to the very weird subway system in New York. At least they have subways. But it doesn't work. Another example is OPEC, the oil petroleum exporting countries. These are countries that try to set the price of the supply. And by limiting the supply will raise prices. But what happens? There's always some member who will start producing more, therefore dropping the price. Pools never really work, even though it happens all the time to this day. But they're always illegal organizations. Not all. There are some legal pools. Like, for example, you ever notice gas prices in Canada? You ever look at gas stations and you ever notice the price? They're always the same. The state of Montana, by state law, every municipality has a pool of gas stations. So it sets the price of gas stations. So if the price goes up, they have to go up for it. Price goes down, they have to go down for it. So if you ever see the price of gas and it's like 2 or 3 cents lower at one station, I guarantee by the end of the day, everybody will be that same price. And there's some ways to cut prices, like they can say you're part of a club, like Costco does that, things like that. But even then, the prices are all pretty much standard for the club too. Therefore, it helps small gas stations. The only problem is gas stations not make so much money on making people look smart, and therefore the big have an advantage. So it's not really working. But that's why you never see different prices. There are other examples of that, but the best example would be gas station. There's pools all the time, and I'll get to it in just 1 second. They don't necessarily have to come together. It just kind of happens, and I'll show you how. So pools are weak. Let me give you another example. Trust. A trust is where, okay, a trust is a way to control their competitors. The big company, the dominant power like Standard Oil creates a trust. Yeah. Okay. Now it's just something weird happened. It's going to drive me nuts. They create a trust. So a big company creates this umbrella organization called the trust. It's technically not a company. But what it does is it goes to competitors and say, turn over your stock to the trust. We'll give you a little piece of it right here of the trust. I'm not going to own you. Just turn over control through your stock to the trust. And then we'll run your company for you. We don't own it, but we'll run it for you. And you'll get a guarantee that you agree to it with this little piece of paper that will guarantee your little percentage of profit. Hey, by all definition, this is pretty scammy. This is a corporation owning another corporation, but it's a way to get around the law. So competitors turn over their stocks to a board of trustees. But what if a company doesn't want to do that? That's where you get the or else. Standard Oil, Rockefeller's company, would go in and they would go to competitors. And this is why they always show it like a beast. The beast is a corporation. This entity, a beast, will come into smaller oil companies and say, turn your stock over to the trust. You're still independent, but we run your company. And if you don't, we will undercut. And not just undercut. We'll make sure that you can't ship your oil to market. We'll make sure no railroads will ship your oil. We will drive you out of business. We will break you. And then we'll make sure no banks will ever give you a loan. We'll make sure no other companies will ever give you a loan. We'll make sure that your children cannot get a job or cannot go to college, for example. We'll make sure that your family and your name is destroyed. If you go against this, you will become our enemy and we will destroy your lives. Or join the trust. Would Rockefeller do this? Yes. Because all he cared about was market share. You stand up to him and he will destroy you. And he had, state governments to make sure that no one will protect you. So they all came in. That is why by the 1880s, trust would be synonymous with monopoly. So when you said trust by 1885, everyone knew you meant something that's going to be like a monopoly. Now, there's two different types of trust. So companies start combining under these trusts, these massive combinations. Combination. There are two different types of combinations. The first one is vertical. And vertical means this. You control the means of production. Another way to look at it, you control the supply chain. So in generic chart world, just imagine you had 8 meat industries, but you control the ranches, the cattle, the slaughterhouse, refrigerated rail cars from the beginning. Heck, you even control the feed, maybe the fertilizer, the alfalfa fields to feed the cattle. You control everything, all the way up to the actual packing of the food. You control it all, bottom to top. That's called vertical integration. Sometimes you see it called vertical trust or vertical monopolies. So everyone got that? This will be a choice on your test. Or we have horizontal. And that's when we think of monopoly, we normally think horizontal. Hold all the alike industries. Here's U.S. Oil Company controlling all the independent oil refineries, putting them under your umbrella. Vertical or horizontal. And there are companies that are both. Like Amazon is very much trying to be both. They're trying to be both. Ship it to control, and Amazon is very much a monopoly that controls prices, has unbelievable amounts of power. If you don't believe me, be a small business and try to compete with Amazon. Won't. It's kind of rigged for them. So, example, horizontal. Now, Rockefeller was both. But his Standard Oil by 1900 would control over 90% of the oil refineries just when oil was becoming a big deal. Cornelius Vanderbilt is New York Central Railroad. Here's an older Rockefeller. Here's showing Rockefeller's kind of vertical integration. He was both. A good example of vertical, we saw the Swift, who controlled many ranches or owned part of it. He bought shares in railroads, controlled the refrigeration cars, the slaughterhouses, the packing plants, etc. Or Andrew Carnegie, Carnegie Steel, his name is Carnegie. Carnegie controlled iron, coal, deals with the railroads, steel mills. And eventually he would sell his to even a bigger monopoly called U.S. Steel. And there's a lot of companies that are both. Because they don't enforce anti-monopoly laws, a company like Netflix is trying to becoming both. They're the distribution, they have movie studios, and they put out, bland, awful shows for the most part, but they have the market share and where else you're going to go. There's some good ones, I would admit, but most. Just wait till they get the generative AI. But that's another story. That's Carnegie. So, another example. J.P. Morgan was an investment banker, and he would start something called interlocking directorates. So what was he doing? He was loaning money to corporations. Loaning money to corporations. The problem was corporations were in capital competition. That means that they're competing each other. One might lose, and Morgan won't get his money back. Morgan wants all the companies to do well, so he always gets his money back. So he spread out risky investors to competitors. Said, I'll loan you money, but then put my people on your boards. So what he would have is he would have his people on the board of directors of competitors. Most famously, the biggest railroads of the Northeast, big money, Pennsylvania, the New York Central, the B&O, the C&O. Every one of those big railroads had J.P. Morgan's guys on it to make sure to avoid undercutting till one went out of business. What did he want? Control the competition. He wanted stability. And so some countries like Japan or Germany, their central bank, by national law, is on the board of directors of competitors. They make sure this doesn't happen. It happens here too. It's been incredibly successful in Japan and Germany. China does this too with their authoritarian government, but they do it with their government. Sure, they have capitalists who are billionaires who make as much money as possible with no rights for their workers, but their government has the final voice. Because their government kind of does it for Japan. That's happening for China. So that's J.P. Morgan. I should add, they all want to act like they're Commodores. So, to this day, it's very wealthy people buy a yacht. Just like very wealthy people also want to become small, farmers and buy a ranch in, let's say, Montana. Right? So they can go around and act like they're a ranch and keep people off their property. But the last one we have to get to is called the holding company. And a holding company is a big deal. Because remember, corporations are trying everything they can to control politics. And they finally won in New Jersey. The New Jersey's Democratic governor died. And a Republican won with support of big business. The Democratic governor was somebody we've had in the past, George McClellan. Remember the General McClellan? The guy who lost to Lincoln in 1864? McClellan was anti-monopoly. But when Republicans took power in New Jersey, they changed their state law to allow corporations to own other corporations. What do we call corporations that own other corporations? Holding companies. All of a sudden, all these corporations moved to New Jersey. They set up headquarters in New Jersey. There's no oil in New Jersey, but Rockefeller moved his headquarters to New Jersey. created Standard Oil of New Jersey so they could own his other Standard Oil under one umbrella and just forget about the trust. And once that happened, the trusts were gone. By the way, that's advertising for the new gas stations. And so they came up with the name for the new gas station for Standard Oil. And they came up with, you see it? Standard Oil. Say this. How do you say that? S-O. S-O. Standard Oil. In the United States, they changed S-O in 1974 because they thought it was kind of boring, there's two S's. They wanted to make it more exciting. So even though all around the world, Standard Oil still operates under S-O, in the US, it operates under, anyone know? X, it's so much cooler. Exxon, yeah, that's Standard Oil. All these companies move. And what did every other state do? Every other state followed. Every other state followed these laws. Soon, corporations could own other corporations. They literally called it merger mania. And all of a sudden, the number of corporations or the number of companies controlling the market halved. And everybody write down one more term, just get this. Oligopolies. And what's going to be created as oligopolies? We're just a few companies control an entire market and operate like a monopoly. And therefore, wealth is going to focus to the big owners of these companies. Fewer companies mean fewer owners. Fewer owners mean more wealth on a few. So if you have like 3 or 4 companies controlling the market, it's a monopoly. They operate like a monopoly. They kind of set the prices. They set wages. They set supply costs. You don't believe me? Look at airline prices. Oligopoly. And on that app, when's your test? Who has 3 tests tomorrow? Who has 2 tests tomorrow? Hey, how about 1? Good luck at your test tomorrow. I'll see you tomorrow, Thursday morning. If you have any questions, there's lots of time built in if you want to stop by. Lots of time. We'll see you then. Yeah.